and welcome to Short Circuit, your podcast on the Federal Courts of Appeals. I'm your host, Anthony Sanders, Director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. We're recording this on June 6, 2023, although the episode won't be released for a few days. We are getting right into the core of some of what we often talk about at Short Circuit, and that is immunity and accountability, focusing today on what's going on in state courts. So joining me, for one, is a very familiar voice to our listeners, and that's one of the leaders of our project on immunity and accountability at the Institute for Justice, Anya Bidwell. Anya,
hey.
Welcome back.
Good to be back.
And also joining me is Jaba Tsitsuashvili, who is one of our happy warriors on the project of immunity and accountability. Welcome back, Jaba.
Thank you, Anthony. Happy to be here.
I congratulate you on pronouncing Jaba's last name relatively.
Did I actually do it that time?
Yeah, you've made
like a 95%?
Yeah, great strides. No, that was really good.
Thanks. We're still working on it here out here in the Scandinavian Midwest, but one day maybe I'll get to 100%. So, Anya, speaking of the Scandinavian Midwest, we're going to start in Iowa today, and some, I guess, unhappy news that some of us received from its Supreme Court a few weeks ago.
Yes. So it is an unhappy news, I suppose. But I want to kind of back out a little and kind of have a bigger picture before I discuss it. So there is this inherent distinction between state and federal courts. State courts have general jurisdiction and common law powers to create remedies. Federal courts are of much more limited jurisdiction, and until 1870s, it was pretty much all about diversity suits. Then after the Civil War, you had a recognition of subject matter jurisdiction, and that's how we get to Bivens suits. You could sue federal officials at common law, but then Bivens came about and said, why don't you just bring cases in federal court directly under the federal constitution? For a while, the Supreme Court saw nothing wrong with that, but then Justice Scalia said, hold on a minute. Creating remedies is a job for state courts. We don't have these kinds of common law powers. We have to wait for Congress to provide us with an authorization. So that's the beginning of the end for Bivens. That's the road to Egbert versus Boulay from last term that we discussed several times on this podcast. The Supreme Court there said that as a general rule, there are no Bivens suits unless Congress specifically authorizes a cause of action. And that's where we come back to Iowa. What about state courts? Scalia specifically contrasted federal courts with state courts and said that federal courts can't create remedies, but state courts can. And post Egbert versus Boulay, there's been a fascinating split in state courts on this issue. Two state Supreme Courts in Nevada and in Michigan said, yeah, we're state courts and we have broader powers than federal courts. We don't need to wait for the legislature to authorize causes of action. Where there is a right guaranteed in our state constitution, there will be a remedy recognized by us. But the Supreme Court in Iowa, in a decision issued a couple of weeks ago, went the other way. It said that state court powers to recognize remedies for common law violations, the ones that Scalia supposedly talked about, are different than state court powers to recognize state constitutional violation. I'm frankly not sure that Scalia made that distinction, but that's the distinction they make. And so they reversed it's their own opinion from 2017 that actually said the opposite, that just like Nevada and just like Michigan, said that you can recognize causes of action directly under the Constitution. So this case, the recent case that reversed the 2017 opinion, is Burnett versus Smith, and the facts are very straightforward. A waste management truck driver alleged that he was wrongfully arrested by an officer of the Iowa Department of Transportation. Burnett, the truck driver, sued directly under the Iowa Constitution for violations of his Fourth Amendment rights, among other things. The wrongful arrest stemmed from the fact that Burnett refused to cooperate in the inspection of the truck. So the officer detained him for obstruction, the charges were dropped, and Burnett turned around and sued the officer. And Iowa Supreme Court used this case as an opportunity to overrule Godfrey, the 2017 decision that said you can sue for damages directly under the Iowa Constitution. Fundamentally, Burnett said that plaintiffs can only sue for damages under the Constitution if the constitutional provision itself specifically authorizes a cause of action. A takings clause that talks about just compensation is pretty much one and only such provision. There aren't any others really, so that's off the table. And if you don't have that authorization within the constitutional text, then you have to wait for the legislature to pass a law authorizing a cause of action, just like Bivens. Just like actually Egbert versus Boulay, that pretty much got rid of Bivens. So in this case, there isn't a law that says you can sue under the search and seizure clause of the Iowa Constitution, so you can't sue. The court does acknowledge, again, that you could sue for common law violations, even if they are constitutional torts. But to the court, torts are not a close enough analog to suits under the Constitution. Sovereign immunity, on the other hand, is a close analog, and according to the Burnett court, shows that we need to wait for the legislature to waive that immunity or authorize damages. The other thing that the court says is that it's not even clear that Godfrey, the 2017 decision, filled the remedial gap since so far the cases that they've seen coming under Godfrey rubric really didn't involve constitutional violations. That's kind of like a practical argument that the court throws out there. Another practical argument is that because Godfrey is a 2017 decision, there is no reliance issues because it's a recent precedent. The other strange argument they make is that these direct suits for constitutional violations under state constitutions are duplicative of Section 1983 claims. And because of that, there is already a remedy, so why bother with state constitutions?
Why bother with the Constitution? I mean...
yeah, it's very...
can't be that
really
important.
The case is a lot about, like, state, court... like common law causes of action versus directly under the Constitution, 1983 versus directly under the Constitution, and the court somehow really thinks that, those kind of, given that you already have these kinds of alternative remedies, that there's nothing necessarily special about suing directly under the Iowa state constitution. Really, fundamentally, to me, the biggest point here is that in state courts, where judges don't have life tenure, the change can come about super quickly. I call this Burnett opinion the revenge of Judge Mansfield, because Justice Mansfield is only one of two judges who was on the court in 2017 when Godfrey was decided, and he dissented along with the other judge who is still on the court. So a new governor appointed 5 new justices, and now we have an opinion going the other way, saying we can't recognize direct cause of actions under the Constitution just 5 years later with no dissents. So it's this opinion leaves a lot to be desired. It doesn't really explain very well, and hopefully, Anthony, we can go in depth about it later in the episode. What is that difference between common law causes of action and state constitutional causes of action, and why is it that when Scalia talks about state courts having common law powers to recognize remedies, that somehow that doesn't apply to when it comes to state constitutions. There isn't much of an exploration of that. It's just really a reversal of the course that it charted in 2017 and saying that fundamentally this is inconsistent with separation of powers and it's frankly, this opinion has been a lot of headache for us, and we don't want to spend much more time dealing with it. So, that's kind of the very much the tenor of the opinion. But at the end of the day, state courts are still active battlefields, right? When it comes to federal courts, on the other hand, that's pretty much a foregone conclusion that you can't sue for damages under the Constitution. Egbert versus Boulay told us that. And before I go and finish with this, I just want to mention something briefly about a Third Circuit decision, She versus Hagen. And this is the latest case that shows that there's pretty much nothing left of Bivens. The facts of the Third Circuit decision are absolutely atrocious. An FBI agent lied during an investigation of a chair of the physics department at the Temple University. This lie then was used as a pretext to break into this guy's home early in the morning, handcuff and search him, search members of his family, turn his house upside down, then take him into custody, interrogate him, take his DNA sample. There was a lie. There's no question about it. The lie was that the physicist, Professor Xi, sent 3 emails to Chinese scientists talking to them about this revolutionary superconductor technology known as pocket heater. Turns out that the officer knew that the Professor Xi's emails had nothing to do with this revolutionary pocket heater technology. And frankly, the pocket heater technology is not that revolutionary in the first place. Nonetheless, he continues the investigation, ruining this guy's life, resulting in raid and arrest, resulting in his demotion, resulting in him being put on administrative leave. And the Third Circuit basically says we really sympathize with the guy. The facts are horrible, right? They are worse than in Bivens by many accounts. But the court says, given Boulay, Egbert versus Boulay, there's really very little we can do here. And it kind of opens with this phrase, but I think it kind of sums up the court's attitude and really what's happening now in federal courts. The opinion begins with the sentence, "Not all rights have remedies, even when they are enshrined in the United States Constitution." So that's pretty much... Yeah, Jaba, by the way, I know that you stopped reading that video after you saw that first sentence. So how does it strike you?
I mean, it's what did Anthony say a minute ago? Like, who cares about constitutions? That's kind of just the theme of these cases. It's just like it becomes, what's that phrase? Like a parchment promise, right? If you have a constitution that gives you all these rights, but then when they're violated, literally nothing can be done about it. And courts are just kind of like, yeah, of course that's the way it should be. It's not the way it should be. Like, who said? Like, why is that the way it should be? And so, like, I think it's just, illustrates it's absurd, but it's like, it's just kind of put out there as just, handed down from on high that that's the way it should be, but it shouldn't be.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how separation of powers is used as an argument, right? That somehow, recognizing a remedy for violation of a constitution is not a judge's job, right? That kind of goes against everything that we learned about being a judge in law school. Somehow you actually can't, look at whether the law was violated and order a remedy if it was, right? That's kind of like Justice Story's thing, but that doesn't seem like the 21st century court's thing.
Yeah, it's getting separation of powers exactly backwards. And if the executive or legislative branch is violating your constitutional rights, and the court is saying they're the ones that you need to essentially beg for the right to do something about it, that's not what separation of powers is. That's the concentration of powers in the legislative and executive.
Ooh, that's a good one.
It's fully backwards.
I like that. That's the concentration of powers in the executive and legislature. That's exactly right.
I'm going to remember that one too.
Yeah.
And with that, I drop the mic and I leave.
That's right. Hold on, we got to talk about Louisiana first.
I'm not going to do better than that, guys.
Yeah, this Iowa opinion really left a lot to be desired, especially because it had a really long kind of wind up where it
Yep.
made a lot of good points. I think kind of the best argument from the side of not having, for want of a better term, implied causes of action. And then it gets to the Constitution and just the state constitution and why it's different than, say if the legislature passed a statute and you're if suing about a statutory right. And then it gets to the Constitution and it's like, and it's even more messed up if courts have remedies for the Constitution itself and just leaves
it there.
And there's not, and I'll get in later when I talk about my piece, I'll get into kind of why that's so messed up. But it was really, it's kind of like a court gets, you get almost all the way there. You get almost all the way to the end zone. Not that I would agree with, the reasoning, but the court gets all the way there. And then just kind of the bottom falls out and there's, there's no touchdown.
Nothing.
There's no score. There's no nothing, but they pretend like they did it.
Yes,
and that's what I really was most disappointed in, I guess, in reading this.
I agree. Same with Mac, right? So the Nevada Supreme Court in Mac, this decision from about a year ago recognized a Fourth Amendment cause of action under the Constitution. And the Burnett Court goes on to try to distinguish Mac. Right. And it kind of, again, it kind of winds it up, kind of sets it up. Now we're going to a death blow to Mac. But then at the end, it's just saying we disagree with Mac.
Yeah, we respectfully disagree. That's about it.
But it's like you're not really explaining what Mac got wrong. You're just saying you're disagreeing with it. The Judge Mansfield does a great job laying it out, but then he really doesn't take it all the way in terms of reasoning.
And they don't mention the Michigan case at all that we previously talked about on Short Circuit. Right. Which were the two kind of big state court opinions from last year that made me think, hey, there's a trend in the states. I should write a piece about this. And I did. And then this Iowa case comes out.
And it reverses its own trend, right?
Because its own we have two trends. Yeah, we have really two trends in the states. Some state courts are recognizing they're different. Some aren't.
Yeah, and I think that's precipitated by Egbert versus Boulay, right, where the Supreme Court is coming down against this idea of implied rights of action under the federal Constitution. And state courts are kind of now thinking, how about us, right? Does that apply to us or are we different? And it's not necessarily an alternative route because you still can't sue federal officials in state courts. So it doesn't really open up a Bivens cause of action in state courts. But it's an incredible alternative remedy for suing state and local officials, especially because in cases like Busserman and Mack, qualified immunity is not a barrier. So that's a great alternative remedy to sue state and local officers. But we are seeing some courts like the Burnett Court going the other way.
Right, and that just to clarify that's because those state courts don't recognize qualified immunity as a defense under state constitutional law. So it's actually better than suing under 1983 in federal court.
Exactly. Yes, like Max said, if the legislature wants to pass a qualified immunity defense to this kind of a claim, it's more than welcome to do so, but it hasn't. So there isn't qualified immunity.
And just on that alternative remedies kind of point where this Burnett court says, but you can sue them under Section 1983. They have a cause of action there. But number one, obviously that just ignores that the states have their own constitutions for a reason.
Right.
Number two, it ignores the difficulty of suing under Section 1983 because of doctrines like qualified immunity and all the ways that the statute's been essentially just kind of neutered. And then the third thing is, this passing of the buck goes both ways because you have a lot of federal judges that say, don't worry about the fact that we've basically eliminated your Section 1983 rights because you can go to state court. And I was just both, it's it's when you go to one department and they say they'll help you in the other and the other says, no, they'll help you in the other. And then you're just stuck and again, it just comes back to, we have these rights but nobody's nobody's willing to acknowledge that they need to be remedied.
But sometimes the legislature passes a law that lets you sue, like in Louisiana. So doesn't that, solve everything, Jaba?
One would hope, but sometimes the courts will say yes, but. So we have a case here out of the Louisiana Supreme Court. In this case, is called. Sorry, I just want to get it right. It's Jameson v. Montgomery, and so just to kind of quick. So again, just as you said, thematically, what this is about is, well, okay, if what really matters is, and what's primary is, what has the legislature told us we can and cannot adjudicate, that feels like it should really kind of carry the day. But this case is an example of where courts don't really mean that when they say it. So the facts of the case are there was a prosecution for a sex crime, and the victims of the family were meeting with the local district attorney I think at the kind of request of the judge to say, can you all figure out what we can do in terms of pleading guilty or not guilty here, and if we can if there's a guilty plea, what the sentence, what an appropriate sentence might be, and things like that. So long story short, the victim's family expressed its desire. They say this is all just coming from the complaint, because this is all just the complaint stage of the case. The victim's family says, we want the accused to serve 1 year behind bars, basically, and we want you to communicate that to the judge, and essentially communicate that if he gets a suspended sentence or something like that, basically our desire is that he spend 1 year behind bars. They say that instead of taking that information to the judge, the district attorney basically misrepresented what the victim's family wanted, and the end result was a guilty plea, but with probation instead of any prison time. And so the family sued the district attorney. They sued a bunch of people, but just to kind of keep it simple, they sued the district attorney involved, and I think his supervisor, and said this was a constitutional violation this violated our constitutional rights as the victims. So just kind of, I'm going to put aside for a second the actual claim itself, and we'll get to that actually, I think, when we talk about the concurrence here. But they say that there's no prosecutorial immunity here, and they say that the reason we know there's no prosecutorial immunity here is because our claim is that the district attorney was intentionally misrepresenting our statements and what we said to him. And there's a Louisiana statute that says that there is governmental immunity, except when you have a claim for a, quote, act or omission that constitutes criminal, fraudulent, malicious, intentional, willful,
ding, ding.
outrageous, reckless, or flagrant misconduct. So there is a statute that says, typically you can get immunity, but if the case that you're bringing alleges the intentional or willful misconduct, then the immunity falls away. So they say, look, we acknowledge that typically this prosecutor has prosecutorial immunity, but the statute gives us a way to get around it. That sounds kind of like an open and shut case, right? That sounds like the very principle we were just discussing of, okay, fine, let the legislature decide. But the majority here says nope. And the reason they say nope is because they had a prior decision basically blessing prosecutorial immunity. The Louisiana Supreme Court had a prior decision blessing, prosecutorial immunity is kind of consistent with constitutional doctrine and history and all of that. And they say, well, this statute that you're relying on now, it was already on the books. And we ignored it then when we decided that prior case. We ignored it then, and so why should we now not ignore it? And that's essentially the reasoning that the court gives. They say, we see the statute, we see its words, but we are not going to suddenly, give it meaning since we didn't before. And so that's kind of the long and short of it. It just goes to show that, it's a heads you lose, tails you lose situation. Like, because, Anya's case, they say we need a statute to authorize this. In this case, we have a statute and they still say no dice. So it's really frustrating. And then just to turn to the concurrence really quick, the concurrence in the dissent here. The concurrence says, look, I think that we need to read this statute by its plain terms. I think there's no way that we're not allowed to just ignore the statute like this. And so I don't think that the DAs here get prosecutorial immunity. But what he goes on to say is, I still think that this claim fails because I don't think that this particular suit alleges a constitutional violation. And so I don't want to get into, I don't see any reason right now for me to get into the merits of, basically, victims' rights and claims and things like that under constitutional provisions. But the point that's worth making on this front is all of these immunities, they close the courthouse doors before we even get to these questions. But it's worth remembering that the courts have made the actual substance of constitutional claims also really hard to bring, right? There's already so many barriers to these suits, even beyond immunity, that when they say, we're going to have a flood of litigation and all of that, and we're going to be, first of all, putting aside just, well, yeah, if you have a flood of rights violations, then you're going to have a flood of litigation, and that's just the way it should be.
In Louisiana?
Frankly.
No way.
Yeah, that's just the way it should be. If you have a flood of violations, you should have a flood of lawsuits. But putting that aside, right, they've already made it so hard to vindicate these rights on the substance. And so when you impose these immunity barriers, even before all of that, it's just layering injustice after injustice.
And that makes me think, Jaba, about the Burnett case, or Burnett. I don't know. In Texas, we say Burnett. Burnett, learn it.
I think in Iowa, it would be Burnett.
Okay, Burnett. So that makes me think about the Burnett case, because there, one of the reasons they say that Godfrey, that recognized constitutional violation, causes of action under the Constitution is not a big deal, because they say plaintiffs are losing on the substance of the constitutional claims anyway. And it's yes, and so why are you using that as a reason to say that there shouldn't be a direct right of action under the Constitution? They kind of, that's just...
it skips the question of why are they losing also. Again,
right.
Because I think you have to remember that one of the reasons they're losing is because the substance of these rights have been eroded too in a lot of ways. And so there's just this double layer.
Exactly.
And I also just want to quickly, and then finally there's a dissent here. There's a one justice dissent that I just love it because it's 1, 2, 3 sentences, and he just disposes of all of it. He says, I'm just going to read it, the whole thing. It says, the district attorney was dishonest with both the victim and the judge. These intentional dishonest acts were outside the course and scope of his duties as an assistant district attorney. I would therefore deny the exception of no cause of action as to the assistant district attorney. That's it. He tears it all apart. He says these are lies and dishonesties. This is not what you're supposed to do. You don't get to weasel out of the case. And so I just loved it for its brevity and its honesty.
And then there's the additional layer here, which you didn't delve into, Jaba, and I don't know enough to really delve into, which is that Louisiana is a civil law jurisdiction. This says the concurrence, and thus, I don't, again, know how Louisiana civil law, the ins and outs of how all that works, but because they're not a common law jurisdiction so much as other states, they really need to look to the statute and not to, whatever doctrines come out of common law. And so therefore you need to really pay attention to the statute. And even then it doesn't go in terms of actually using the statute.
Yeah. So again, I think in a lot of ways it's hard to know what animates, what animates these decisions and what's truly kind of why they're doing what they're doing. It could be that they thought this case was weak in the way that the concurrence says, and therefore they just weren't willing to kind of do the right thing on this one. But like, that shouldn't be the basis, right? You should just set out the rules, and then some cases will win and some cases will lose, and we got to hear them all, because when there are rights violations, there's got to be a remedy.
Yeah, I still can't get over how they interpreted a statute that came out before a case to incorporate that case, because otherwise the court would have just been ignoring that statute, and courts don't do things like that.
Well, it also gets at like the concurrence says it seems like that statute just wasn't raised in that prior case, right? And so it's, for whatever reason, again, you can't just use you can't say we made an error once, or this wasn't presented to us before, and therefore we must double down on it. It's just
it's inconsistent with the Burnett case, right, where they're basically saying, we can overturn the precedent. Like, we don't like it for so many different reasons. It's really hard to execute. Like, what the hell is the alternative remedy? How are we supposed to figure out what the alternative remedy is? And what about punitive damages? Oh my God, we have to deal with that too? And attorney's fees? No, it's too much headache. We're just going to overturn this case. And then you have that in Louisiana, where it's like, the case is obviously inconsistent with the statute, right? And but no, precedent is sacrosanct.
Stare decisis is no longer for suckers all of a sudden. Yes,
and that happens all the time, where courts will say, "Well, this actually, doesn't bear on this statute or this constitutional provision because it wasn't argued in that case." And so when we do talk about in this case, it's not actually going against that prior precedent because it wasn't an issue in that case, and yet here they got that reasoning in exactly backwards.
There's a lot wrong here. There's a lot of bad.
Well, I was encouraged at least by that concurrence and the dissent, because I think the concurrence really reads as a dissent, even though if in this particular case it wouldn't have been for the plaintiffs.
Yeah,
and so
maybe on the immunity ground. It was a very solid dissent on the immunity ground.
Yeah.
It's just like, no, this is not the way this is supposed to work.
So maybe that shows a little bit of hope for the future in Louisiana, but this is another layer of precedent now.
There was a good decision in Iowa in 2017, and then the court changed. In 5 years, we got a completely different situation, and that kind of, I guess, goes to this idea of like what is so special about federal courts, right? And federal courts have much more stability than state courts. On the one hand, that's a bad thing, but on the other hand, it's a good thing, right? And with state courts, some hard-earned victories, and Godfrey was a very hard-earned victory, just evaporated in a matter of, barely any years. So that's something for us to keep in mind as we are considering state courts as alternatives to federal courts when vindicating people's civil rights.
Yeah, you can see plus and minus, and that's, of course, a really large discussion about the length of judicial tenure and life tenure and elected judges. And we're not going to go down that road today, but there's definitely pros and cons there. So finally, I will direct our listeners' attention to something I wrote that was published by the good people at Arc Digital a few weeks ago. We'll put a link up in the show notes. You can usually, Arc Digital is a platform that is kind of a like Substack, and so you can usually read an article even if you don't have a subscription, at least once or twice. So most people out there, if you find it in the show notes, you'll be able to link to it or to get to it and to read it. But you should also consider subscribing to Arc Digital, as they do good work and for many different writers who write there. But the headline is, "Where does the law come from?" And I was pushed towards writing this because in working with Anya and Jaba and Patrick Giacomo and others at IJ who do this kind of work, it really, the more I've been thinking about it since IJ got into this area, the more I've been realizing how this whole modern critique, of Bivens and those kinds of cases where you have implied causes of action under the Constitution because legislature, Congress didn't make one for you, how they're really kind of getting the history wrong. So I read some of that history and I started writing. I think maybe for the listeners today, what I should talk about is a bit about like the writing process of how I put this together actually changed and got even, I think, stronger in saying we should have these implied causes of action as I was researching it. So I was writing about how there's a certain kind of logic that I think a lot of probably listeners and lawyers and judges get into about causes of action for like violating statutes. So it used to be kind of not for that long actually in the 60s and 70s that the Supreme Court was all into implied cause of action when there's a statute. So Congress, and of course a lot of it was tied up with the Civil Rights era. So Congress passes a statute and then often they'll have something in there that says, if someone violates this law, you can sue them for damages. Okay, fine. But then often Congress wouldn't do that. And so the court would be like, well, they meant to do that. And so we're just going to, come up with our own cause of action like we would under common law for, like negligence or something that's purely through the courts.
Let me
to
briefly
sue for damages.
There's this case, Borak, from 1964, right, in the Supreme Court. And the case basically says it is the duty of the courts to be alert to provide such remedies as are necessary to make effective the congressional purpose.
Yes. Yeah. So the court is kind of making up and I don't use making up pejoratively there. I just say they're coming up with, you might say, this cause of action for damages to make that statute, get its purpose out there, and not just have to go to, the prosecutors or the federal agency, whoever it is that normally would prosecute that statute when people violate it. So this has become, but then over the course of like the 80s and after, this became not an accepted rule in federal courts and state courts. And so today it's hard to find any kind of court that kind of will come up with its own implied cause of action for a statute. And I've always thought about that until recently that makes some sense because you wouldn't have that law in the first place without the legislature. And so it's kind of like the legislature giveth, the legislature can take it away. And so if they want to also give a cause of action, then it's up to the legislature to do that. I thought, that kind of makes sense. But then on the other side, you have the Constitution. So the Constitution says you have this right. Government can't violate it. Government agents violate it. And you can't sue them unless you have the legislature, which is actually subordinate to the Constitution, create your cause of action, right? This is this outrage that we've been talking about earlier in the show about in Iowa, Louisiana, wherever. Why should you have to depend on the legislature to vindicate your constitutional rights?
Pre-existing rights.
Which, or pre-existing, whether they're pre-existing or created by the Constitution, they're above the legislature. They're above the cops and the governor and all of that. So it should be different when it comes to a Constitution because then it's like, why should you defer to the legislature? Why not the courts? That the Constitution doesn't say. The Constitution just gives this right. And when it's violated, of course you should have a remedy. So that's why I started writing this piece. And then as I'm digging into this stuff, it hasn't been really like a big part of my scholarship in the past. I come across this article that I am now raving to everyone about. And you should all go and read. It's a law review article from 1986 by Professor Miles Foy, who is actually still a professor at Wake Forest School of Law. And it goes into the history, like deep history or deep, common law English history of implied causes, or not really implied, but causes of action for acts of parliament, right? That legislature we had before Congress. It's called Some Reflections on Legislation, Adjudication, and Applied Actions in the State and Federal Courts. And anyway, long story short is this article, I think more than anything I've read, shows that actually, if you go back to the founding of the country and then before, courts made up remedies for legislative acts that did not have their own causes of action all the time. Now, it wasn't automatic, but it would be something courts would do to effectuate what, Parliament or later Congress or state legislature was trying to do with a law. And they actually did this well into the 19th century. And somehow near the end of the 19th century, it kind of became less of a thing. And so then when the Supreme Court started doing it again in the 1960s, everyone now says that was judicial activism. The Warren Court is doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And it was just because of the civil rights era and they had to do it. And actually, I think they didn't say it very well at the time, but they were going back to what was really a traditional method. And then that was, disposed of as it came to be. So today, when we talk about, a court coming up with a remedy for a violation of the Constitution, I mean, to me, that makes it even stronger that, traditionally they came up with remedies for violations of statutes, even when the legislature didn't say that. And I have tried to research what's been said about this history, and a few scholars have tried to distinguish it or say, well, different for federal courts because of various historical reasons. But when it comes to state courts, like in Iowa, right, there's no leg to stand on. And this kind of modern conception that courts just don't come up with remedies unless you're purely talking about common law, like negligence, is ahistorical. It's not grounded in anything. And so, all the judges should go out there and read Professor Foy's article and judge accordingly.
And it kind of goes back to this idea that the Warren Court, while it's a great civil rights court, did a horrible job of explaining itself, right? It just kind of said, oh, here it is, like the Bivens decision too. If you talk to scholars, a lot of them will say it's really the framing of Bivens that's a problem, where, Justice Brennan just goes into coming up with this, ideas of, this two-step framework and, cautioning hesitation, all this weird language. It really sounds like he's making stuff up.
Yeah.
Right? Compared to if he were to say, listen, at common law, since the founding of this country, you could sue federal officials for violations of individual rights. So you should be able to continue to sue federal officials for violations of individual rights. If he were to say it that way, then I think conservatives would have had much less problem with it and frankly would have had a hard time attacking it. And the same goes to your point, Anthony, with implied causes of action when Congress passed a statute, right? If they were to explain it as, listen, that's what happened during, parliamentary republic that we were part of once, a parliamentary monarchical republic. Then,
well, that would be going back to the 1650s, but we'll just say the former system.
Let's stay away from that. But yeah, if they were to talk about it in those terms, I think they would have been much more persuasive rather than just saying it is what it is. This is how we feel like doing it. And that's why Scalia attacking it as a heady days, right? They were arrogant.
I guess the only thing I'll say is that they would have been much more persuasive to the people that needed to be persuaded in this way. Because, frankly, the way that Bivens is written, I don't think I'm unpersuaded by the way Bivens is written. But if you want to kind of close off lines of attack from people like Scalia and whoever else who want to attack it in this way, that's how you should have written it.
No, I think there's a lot to be said that the judges during the Warren Court era were politicians, and they wrote as politicians, and some of that was very persuasive, and some of it, when in later years we get these career judges, right, who have been star appellate court judges for years, and then they're placed on the Supreme Court, like the kind of judges we have now. That's a different audience, and these politicians from the 50s and 60s don't ring right to those of today, even if they were right. They weren't writing it as in the right way in every case. Of course, a lot of times they were wrong. I get that, but we're talking about a case where they were correct, but they weren't writing for the correct audience, I guess is how I'd put it. Yep. Well, there you go. Everyone listening now knows what's wrong, what's right. We had a show a few months ago where we talked about, I think, both of these the cases from Nevada, the Mack case, and then the Michigan case, and how things are going in the right direction in state courts, and that's kind of what I write about in my article. We have a couple cases now that are not in the right way in state courts, but I guess the overall it shows that in state courts, where these judges have common law authority and always have to interpret, to create causes of action, and they also have their own state constitutions, and sometimes they even have acts of the legislature. There's still hope. There's quite a lot of hope, more hope than in the federal courts. And we will see how these things progress. So thank you both for coming on and enlightening our listeners with this, perhaps not happy news, but news they can use.
Thanks, Anthony.
And I'm taking concentration of power with me.
Yes. I just want credit.
Somehow Jaba will be credited. And for the rest of you, thank you for listening, and I hope that all of you get engaged.